So today I'll be talking about the role of cover crops in our path to sustainable intensified agriculture. Cereal is great at reducing nitrogen loss. Actually, we determined that there was about 46 to 49% reduction. There are some adaptive management strategies that we're using because we're finding that cereal only returns about 10% of its residue biomass nitrogen. And so we have to adapt and compensate for that nitrogen reduction in uptake that we might see. So I want to talk about, I built a narrative using multiple research projects, and not just one project, and several of them are funded by NREC. And I would note that we're looking at the impact of cover crops plus for our management to see if we can find what we call sustainable intensified agriculture, a principle by which we can produce at maximum yield, but yet maintain or decrease the environmental footprint. So that's the goal. So I want to start off with just some background and narrative. So within the last decade, there's been a significant reemergence of the use of cover crops. We know it's not new, so I say reemergence of the use of cover crops. And when you think about it and you talk and interview farmers, you'll find that there are two reasons. Number one, farmers are aware of the nutrient loss to the Great Lakes, nutrient loss to the Gulf of Mexico, and that a significant component of that nutrient loss comes from fields with row crop agriculture. And that's both nitrogen and phosphorus. And so farmers are responsible, I think, and they're looking for methodologies in order to keep the nitrogen, keep the nutrients, the phosphorus in the field instead of in the water. Secondly, I think that farmers are looking to be more sustainable, right? So they're looking to have the land that they're farming there for their great-grandchildren. And so they're looking at principles of soil health, sustainable systems that produce soil health results that increase soil health. So those are the two major reasons why I think we see this resurgence in cover crop adoption. However, less than 5% of row crop agriculture in the upper Mississippi River Basin actually has cover crops on them. And so that leads me to say, well, that's job security, because there's a lot of questions that have yet to be answered by myself and my colleagues. And so I began to think about some of the questions as I work with farmers. And so this is a farmer who is in corn, and he actually planted cereal in between. I was thinking, what kind of questions are in his mind as he drives over the landscape, the field, in order to plant his corn, his second crop of corn. You know, one question could be, you know, how much cover crop biomass do I actually have? How much cover crop biomass do I have, and how much carbon did I generate with the growing of this cereal cover crop? The second question could be is, you know, I generated this biomass, and I know that the biomass has carbon and nitrogen in it. How much nitrogen did I conserve with the growth of this cover crop in this biomass? So if it's in the biomass of the cover crop, it can't denitrify, and it's not leaching. And so that's a positive. That's a positive. But then I can imagine this farmer thinking further and saying, well, if I have nitrogen there in the biomass, how much of it is going to release into the soil solution and be available for me to use with my subsequent cash crop? So therefore, maybe, just maybe, I can reduce my input costs with nitrogen fertilizer. That's also a thought that I've heard from farmers. And then last, you know, this carbon that I generated with this biomass, could it cause nitrogen immobilization? And then how much nitrogen will be immobilized, and what's my adjustment? What's my adaptive management in order to overcome the nitrogen that may be immobilized by the soil bugs or the soil microbiome that will not release it during this first year during the year of my corn growth? And so these are a lot of questions that when I talk to farmers or when I speak, I try to sneak out the room, and they say, wait, Doc, we have some questions, right? And these are the questions that they're asking. And so we took the task of trying to answer these questions in my research program. And so One of the things that there's no question about, however, is the fact that cover crops can reduce nitrate loading through tile drainage, okay? So I'm gonna show you a series of work, and you'll see Laurel come behind me and basically echo the same thing at a different location. So this first site is in central Illinois on a farmer's field. We've been there since 2014. It's the first year we received funding and implemented the tile drain system. I'm working there along with Michael Rafati, and Michael Rafati has a poster with more detail that I'm presenting at this moment. And so this is an NREC-funded proposal collaboration between Illinois State and Purdue University. And so we're looking at the impact of cover crops and nitrogen management and timing of the application of the nitrogen management on the loading or mass loss of nitrogen through tile drainage and crop yield. And so this is just a breakdown of what it looks like. You may have seen this before. So this farmer allowed us to come into his field and augment the field with intensive tile drainage, right? So we have 15 individual fields. That's about 1.5 acres in surface area, which gives you about 72 rows wide, so you can get a couple runs of field scale equipment. So this is a field scale project. And each of those plots are monitored. The tile drainage is monitored. So everything that we do on the surface, we can see the impact of the surface management in the tile water, and if there is an impact. And so it's a very complex but a lovely system to work in. You know, when I came to this farmer, he was already conservation minded. He was already soil health minded before the word was really, really popular. His practices is strip till before corn and no till before beans. He has, on average, when I got there, 3.5% organic matter. So this is a rich molly soil, very good location to work in. His nitrogen management was 50%, about a 50-50 split of fall and spring, and we kind of went with that and continued to develop his management. And so I like to show this slide because it kind of indicates that we're not broadcasting the cover crops in the field. We're actually using field scale equipment. This is a retrofitted Hagee where we can come in at R6 in corn and at maturity of the soybeans before leaf drop really starts, drop the cover crop, which is cereal rye and radish, at the base of the plant, and then gives it a chance to grow, get some soil-to-seed contact when we do get a good rainfall. We were seeding at a range of 45 to 74 pounds per acre. We started out high, and then we started understanding that, hey, we don't need that much. So over the years, we've gotten a little smarter by listening to farmers, and we cut back on our rate. And we were planting about mid-September, and this unit actually allows us to do that when most people have to wait until after harvest to plant. So we wanted to foster an environment that gives us the best cover crop growth so that we can have a good test. So when you think about the cover crop growth itself, over the years, you can see the blue line that you see here that's going over the top of those bars are growing degree days. And so you can see kind of a correlation between when you have a lot of heat units, you get pretty good cover crop growth. And when you don't have a lot of heat units, you don't get as much growth. I can say that the biomass on average was about 1,141 pounds per acre of biomass. And so we were terminating aggressively 2 to 3 weeks before planting in order to try to reduce the CNN ratio. The range of biomass from 15 to 2019 ranged from like 400 pounds per acre. That was in a tough year when it was colder than average. And then upwards to about 1,900 pounds per acre of biomass. So what does that look like as far as nitrogen uptake? So how is this cover crop actually performing in scavenging nitrogen? So on average, we get about 41 pounds per acre of nitrogen in the cover crop biomass, okay, about 41 pounds per acre. And that can range from a very cold year to 51 pounds to 71 pounds in a year where we're actually getting really good growth. So when you think about this cover crop is growing in the fall, it's interacting with what pools of nitrogen? So you have, if you're in a corn situation, or you're coming out of corn going into soybeans, it's interacting with residual fertilizer nitrogen. And every year, despite what the cash crop is interacting with nitrogen that's soil derived. So that's mineralized from the soil organic matter, okay? And so when doing that in field, the question is can this cover crop, while scavenging nitrogen, reduce the amount of nitrogen that actually gets to the tile drainage? And so over time, we were able to see two things, okay? Because we had 4R treatments with and without cover crops, we could isolate the effect of 4R nitrogen management, fall versus spring application, versus or relative to adding cover crops to that. And so what we saw was that initially, over time, there's not much difference when you just have 4R management. It's because that soil has such high organic matter and such high mineralization, and so it's flooding the soil solution by itself with nitrate, okay? And so just changing your rate or manipulating the rate is not as effective as having another crop growing over a 3-month period scavenging nitrogen. And so when you add cover crops to that 4R system, so 4R plus, you get a range of nitrogen loss reduction through the tile drainage of 46 to 49%, which is significant. In the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy, they are estimating that you get about 30%. So we were able to actually, in the field, we saw about 46 to 49% reduction, and that's despite the timing of the end application. And so that lets you know that this cover crop is working very well at scavenging nitrogen that's residual from the fertilizer pool and nitrogen that's soil derived from soil mineralization as far as the spring nitrogen application system. So this is on a plot scale where we can control everything, right? And so another funded project where I'm a co-PI with Captain O'Reilly, who's in the room today. If you have any tough questions, ask her, okay? And on a watershed scale in central Illinois, in the village of Towanda, we identified 2 watersheds, like mid-sized watersheds. The larger watershed at the southern portion is about 1,100 acres. The smaller watershed at the top is about 770 acres. We cover crop approximately half of the larger watershed. And we wanted to see, without affecting the management, trying to control the management of the farmers, if we could cover crop and see maybe a signal of increased water quality in this watershed. And it's also testing whether farmers can work together on a watershed scale in order to get a product of better water quality while maintaining their production. And so this is just a snapshot of what it looks like in the watershed. We were able to get equivalent growth on a watershed scale as we saw on a plot scale, but we were using a different method of applying and planting this cover crop. Here on a watershed scale, we're not using a Hagie. We actually had one pilot that flew on all of the acres in that larger watershed. And over the years, I don't think we've ever not had a stand. The stand has varied, just like we saw on a plot scale, but we've had a stand each year. And so let's see what's the impact of water quality. And so what you have here is flow-weighted nitrogen application, flow-weighted nitrogen concentration. And so in the black, that's the non-cover crop. In the green, that's the cover crop. You can see as the system matured, you started to see a reduction in the concentration of nitrogen that's that's coming out through the tile drainage. This is just showing that initially there was a 18% increase of nitrogen loss where we had the cover crops, and that speaks to this concept of legacy nitrogen. So the cover crop in the first year was not able to overcome the management that had occurred years prior to us coming to starting the project. But over time, as the system matured, we did see reductions of estimated 33 to 36%. And this is on a watershed scale. We only cover crop 50% of the acreage, right? So no question, cover crops are able to reduce nitrogen loss through tile drainage in our region. Okay, the bigger question is, okay, environmentally we're good. Okay, we're doing a good job, but the challenge is can we have that same CRI and have maximum production of corn or soybean, right? And so we looked at that. Soybean yield, we saw no difference. And I'm showing 16, but we have multiple years, and they all look the same, so I'll just show one. No impact of CRI on soybean yield. In another study that we did in Indiana, we did find that in a wet year, you could have some reductions in nitrogen uptake, biomass of that soybean, and thus leading to a yield loss. But in an average year, and at this site, we saw no impact. Corn, however, was significantly different from what we saw for soybean. And those who've seen this talk kind of know the story. In a year like 2015, we had good soil mineralization. We had good oxygen levels in the soil, so microbes were able to do their work on that 3.4% organic matter soil, generate nitrate and ammonium, put it into solution, and thus able to overcome the nitrogen uptake and scavenging power of that CRI. And so the corn reacted and gave about equal yield except in the spring system. But in 2017, and the same data applies, the same trend applies in 2019, where we had a wet spring, where we had CRI, we had a significant reduction in yield. And so I begin to think that I'm the only one in the world that's seeing this, because all of my other colleagues are saying, hey, I don't know why you're seeing this reduction. So we scavenged the literature, and we looked at it on a regional basis across 6 states, 773 paired observations of just CRI before corn and soybean, and you can see the breakdown there. We still saw, based on the data from other experiments and field level on-farm trials, when you look at CRI before corn, there was about a 6% reduction. CRI before bean, there was about a 6% reduction. So the question is now, I'm curious, what's happening? Because I'm not the only one seeing this. What's happening? And so we had a couple tough days in the field, and you can see here, these are days when my graduate students hate me, right? These are days when I know I'm going to have to come back to the office with some pizza or something to make them stay. And so this is them carrying corn samples out of the field, and this is what the truck looks like when we're on the way back to the lab to then spend another 3 hours breaking the sample down, okay? And so I'm really grateful to them. And so what we saw over time, so on the vertical axis is corn in uptake, right? And on the horizontal axis is the different growth stages of the corn. And so this yellow line represents the non-CRI corn, and this is the CRI corn. This is the zero control, okay? And so you can see at about V12, which is equivalent to 50 to 65 days after CRI termination, we see a significant separation and reduction in the acquisition of nitrogen by corn where CRI was grown, okay? When you extrapolate out and fast forward to R6, that equates to about 66 pounds per acre deficit of nitrogen. So the question now is, where's that nitrogen, right? And so we then do a series of studies to look at how fast or what's the profile or the distribution of the rate of decomposition of the CRI. So we found peak decomposition rate at about V3 to V6 in that range. And then we looked at the microbial activity and found peak activity in response to this degradation of the cover crop at about V6. I said, okay. So then we see corn in uptake begins to get linear at about V6. And so I'm thinking, hey, we have synchronization. So we have a tug-of-war going on between possibly the microbes and the corn for nitrogen in the system, okay? And this is, again, happening right at that 55 to 65 days after CRI termination. So I came up with this theory, and so this is a model based upon all of the data that we've collected thus far at the tile drain site in central Illinois. And so first, you see the non-cover crop system. It has no green in it, so 72% of the nitrogen balance is in the soil available. 28% in the blue is lost through the tile drainage. When you add cover crops to that system, a significant portion of that 72% then is scavenged by the cover crop and assimilated into its structure. So it cuts the availability in half, but it significantly reduces what you're losing through the tile drainage. The idea and the theory is that part of this green is going to contribute to the brown, and the corn will have enough by the end and produce good grain. But the reality is that release from the green to the brown is very slow, so therefore we just put the green in the non-available category. And so now we have a management challenge in order to meet the deficit that the cereal created while it was growing, right? So that leads me to this next study where we actually used 15N nitrogen, meaning that we were able to use isotopes to label the nitrogen. And the idea is that we want to feed the cereal the nitrogen, right, so that we can track it into the cereal, then track it into the soil after termination, and then plant the corn, and then track it into the corn, and then measure the corn at harvest to see how much of the cereal residue in actually makes it into the corn at harvest and being used to produce bushels. And so what we found is that over time on the x-axis, and then we have percent cereal nitrogen recovery in the soil on the y-axis, the vertical axis, is that there's a linear increase from termination up until about, let's say, V6 to VT. And that's similar to what we saw on a plot scale when we were looking without the isotopes. And so significant return and degradation of the residue is allowing the nitrogen to leave from out of the residue of the cereal and then be deposited into the soil. At what form, we don't know, okay? And so with that said, we saw that the corn and soybean are actually recovering only 10 and 7.3% of the cereal nitrogen that was at termination in the biomass the year over the entire growing season of corn and soybean. So what is that saying to farmers is that we cannot, with cereal, we cannot say we want you to reduce, if you have 40 pounds of nitrogen in your cereal, we cannot tell farmers, hey, you can reduce your nitrogen rate by 40 pounds. That's not the case. You're only getting about 4 pounds out of that 40 pounds that actually goes into the crop. So that leads us to think cereal has the tendency to contribute more to the soil organic matter content rather than to putting nitrogen in solution. And that makes sense. That's why we see a reduction in the loss through the tile drainage. But farmers need to know that, because if that's not what they're after, they need to think about another cover crop to select that would have a lower C/N ratio. So if only, let's say, 10% is actually getting into the plant, then where's the other 90% and what pool is it in? So I have another graduate student who's looking at the distribution of cereal nitrogen following termination. And I want you to focus on the last bar, okay? The last bar here. And what you see is about 59% of the cereal nitrogen, when it breaks down and you can't see it anymore and it goes into the soil matrix, it's in a pool that's organic nitrogen. That organic nitrogen pool, the plant cannot see it, okay? 27% is still, although you can't see it, it still has not fully decomposed, okay? It's only been sized to where we can't see it but have not decomposed. Only 14% is actually available for the corn or soybean following to actually use to produce bushels, okay? And so that matches the 10% that we saw of uptake with the previous study. And so from that point, and this is the last study, from that point, we begin to think about how can we alter the management or adapt the management of nitrogen fertilizer for corn following cereal. And I've often heard farmers and NRCS recommend using starter. So then the question becomes, well, how much starter? So you just can't tell a farmer, use starter, right? How much starter? Because that matters on what type of equipment he buys and so forth. And so we tried to optimize the starter rate of nitrogen. And so that does not mean add more nitrogen because you have cereal rye. That means push a larger percentage of what you add at side dress onto the planter in order to offset for what the cereal rye takes when it grows. So again, we're trying to approach that balance of maintaining the production while decreasing the environmental footprint. So basically what we did was we found sites, we planted cereal rye, we got pretty good growth, and then we come back and we sample that cereal rye, determine the nitrogen and carbon in the biomass. We sampled the soil to determine the nitrogen content at planting. We then sampled the corn once it starts growing over multiple growth stages to look at the impact of uptake. And we looked at the nitrogen content in that corn and also the carbon content. And so here's just a shot of the cereal rye performance in this trial. And so we had 3 sites. We got an average biomass of about 1,200. That's what we saw in previous studies. In uptake ranged from 19 to 33 pounds per acre, right? We saw an average of about 41, okay? The carbon content. Now, notice, farmers, the difference in the nitrogen content versus the carbon content. So when you see that magnitude difference, the question becomes, which one should we really be managing for, right? Most of us are worried about 20 pounds of nitrogen, but there's 414 pounds or kilograms per hectare of carbon. And I think that's the real variable that we should start managing for. So when you look at springtime at planting, differentials in nitrogen in the soil, we definitely had significantly less nitrogen in the soil where you had cereal rye. And so the question is can we offset that deficit with the starter on the planter? So here's a shot of the darker gray line is the in-uptake of corn without cereal rye. The lighter gray line is in-uptake of corn with cereal rye, and you can see that same gap forming as we saw previously, right at the same time at about V11 or VT when the plant is trying to convert over to reproductive growth. Okay, we're running out of nitrogen. When we add starter from 0 to 75 pounds on the planter, we were able to actually overcome some of that nitrogen gap. And now the question becomes, can we actually see that translate into yield? And this is what we saw. At one of 3 sites, we did see significant reduction in cereal rye when we didn't have starter in those treatments. And so that's going to happen. At that one site, that's a well-drained site. The other 2 sites are poorly drained. And so drainage plays a significant portion. Secondly, at 2 of 3 sites, when we added 50 pounds of nitrogen, we were able to get at least equal or greater corn yield relative to the non-cereal rye, non-starter control where we had cereal rye. Third, I think is most impactful, is that 3 out of 3 sites where we added starter versus not where we had cereal rye, we were able to get an increase in yield of 1.3% to 13.4%. So I summarized as I went through because I knew I had a lot to talk about. And so at this time, I'll take any questions if there's time.